Pode ser o Grupo Corpo ou a Companhia de Dança do Pantanal. Museu de Arte Moderna de São Paulo ou Arte em Cores. Filarmônica de Minas Gerais ou Programa Vale Música. Restauração do Museu Nacional ou da Cripta da Basílica de Nazaré. Onde tem cultura, a Vale está. Dos projetos que todo mundo já conhece, até aqueles projetos que todo mundo precisa conhecer. A cultura brasileira tem o nosso apoio. É valorizando essa cultura que crescemos e evoluímos juntos. Instituto Cultural Vale. Ministério da Cultura e a Associação Casa Azul apresentam 21ª Flip, Festa Literária Internacional de Paraty. A Flip conta com benefício da Lei de Incentivo à Cultura, Lei Rouanet, PRONAC 231427, e possui acessibilidade para pessoas com deficiência física, visual e auditiva. Tem patrocínio Master, Instituto Cultural Vale. Patrocínio Ouro, Itaú, CCR e Caixa. Patrocínio Prata, O Globo, Mac Imóveis e Sebrae. Patrocínio Bronze, Globo Livros e Eletronuclear. Parceria institucional Sesc, Prefeitura de Paraty, Embratur e Museu do Território. É uma concepção, Associação Casa Azul. Realização, Ministério da Cultura, Governo Federal, Brasil, União e Reconstrução. encontro da literatura com a cidade.
Good afternoon. Thank you for attending. And this morning, almost afternoon, we will have this roundtable session called My Heart Still Beats. I am Milena Brito. I'm one of the curators. And we have the session, and it is quite interesting for all of us. We have two original voices who will talk to us about how classic literature will interfere in their very contemporary modern production. To mediate this conversation between Marcial, Gala, and Luiza Romão, we have a Princeton professor, literary critic, a translator, Pedro Meira Monteiro. Great session. Good afternoon, and thank you. Please join me, everyone. Good afternoon, one and all. It is a pleasure to be here with you. I am Pedro Meira Monteiro, as Milena announced. First of all, I would like to thank Flip and this enormous team, both the visible and the invisible team, and all those who are preparing this, the interpreters, sign language interpreters. Thank you all. And very specifically, I would like to thank our dear Milena and Fernando, our curators, for having invited us to mediate this wonderful session. It is such a gift for someone to mediate this session. We have here Luiza Romão. Welcome, Luiza. And Marcial Gala. So I will introduce both very briefly so that we can start our session immediately. This is about different literatures and different places where literature happens. Luiza Romão was born in 1992 in Ribeirão Preto, inland São Paulo. She's a poet, an actress, she's a slammer. She wrote Sangria. This was published by Selo do Burro in 2017, and the very accomplished and awarded Também Guardamos Pedras Aqui by publishing house Nós in 2021. It won the Jabuti Award, Best Poetry and Best Book of the Year. She was also shortlisted for the Oceanos Award. This will be published in France by Nossa Edición, and this week in Mexico, she is launching the book. Not only that, but also in Argentina, and with a translation into German. It's almost ready. So Luiza is also the author of Nadine, published by Quelônio 2022. I will show you the books. This is Nadine, as I said, from Quelônio 2022. And in Argentina, we will have, actually, it was launched by Mandacaru in a special edition, bilingual edition. And did I leave it in the? Well, I didn't bring it. It's under your tablet. I can see it from here. It's a tiny little thing. It's a beautiful book, and it is Também Guardamos Pedras Aqui from Nós. This is a very wonderful and accomplished book. She's also she's a bachelor in scenic arts, and she's a master in literature and compared literature by the University of São Paulo. Marcial Gala was born in Havana in Cuba in 1965. He lived for many years in Cienfuegos, also in the island, and he's been living in Buenos Aires for many years. He's a poet, he's an architect, and he's the author of many books published in many languages, among them Sentada en su verde limón from 2004, Rock and Roll, which is rock and roll from 2006, and La Catedral de los Negros, and it's this one here that I hope it will be the next book published in Portuguese. It is a beautiful book. And this was launched in 2012. Marcial has many literary awards, among them Pinos Nuevos de Contos Alejo Carpentier for novels, and the Critics Award for the best books published in Cuba in 2012. And finally, the book which in a certain way brought him to Brazil, which is Call Me Cassandra. And it is just recently published in Brazil by Biblioteca Azul, and Marcial was awarded in the Spanish version in 2018. In Argentina, the award Enye from Clarín in Buenos Aires. The translation into Portuguese in Brazil was by Paceri Dias Alves de Souza. So welcome, both of you. It's a pleasure to have you here. And I would like to maybe start by, stating the obvious. This isn't obvious, but sometimes falls as a bomb, because the fact that we are under the sign of a war, and Call Me Cassandra, as well as Guardamos Pedras Aqui, has this very interesting play with the Iliad. But this is different. It is a bit more flexible, rewritten, re-understood. So I would like to ask both of you, both Luiza and Marcial, why is the classic literature is necessary to talk about the present? How was it for you to write this, and how was it to recover and revisit the Iliad? Would you like to start, Luiza? Yes, I would like to start. I would like to start, first of all, by thanking you. Thank you, Marcial, thanking Pedro and Flip's team. It's the first time I'm here. I'm so moved. I'm a bit nervous, too. And I would like to thank Milena, Fernanda. And it's special to be here in a Flip that will actually pay tribute to Patricia Galvão Pagu, an activist that was really a trailblazer for all of us here today. All of us here today are able to speak and have a voice. She has a letter she wrote to her son when she was incarcerated, when she was in prison, and she, during the new state, the so-called state, the Getúlio Vargas state here, and this has to do with war and Troy, where she asks her son to follow the path of truth, of intelligence, and justice. And given this chaotic world, I can't remember what the words exactly, but facing this chaotic world, that he might choose dignity. So it's so good to be in this Flip that is exactly asking for a human dignity in this moment in which we have so many technologies of death operating against us. So if poetry can do something given this devastating world situation, it is to try and elaborate this violence and face it. And why the Iliad? Because I guess much of what this politics of massacres and devastation starts in that poem. That will be the basis of Western literature and this whole school of thought that will define the basis of what we still today understand as politics, as art, as humanity with a H, with capital H. The first time I read, I was traveling inland Bolivia. I mean, Bolivia is inland, so I was traveling in Bolivia, and I visited where Che Guevara was killed, with many Cuban friends with me, trying to demonstrate in this rural area in the heart of South America, this heart that beats still in the devastated cities. And I was reading the Iliad, and I remember the shock, the awe of this work. I think I had never had contact with such a violent book. I normally, Tarantino movies are nothing compared to the Iliad, because it's one scene after the next of torture, innumerable ways of denying the other, to subjugate others, and to impinge pain. So this is the narrative that will define the basis of Western civilization. So this bloody reporting, this bloody structure will reach the Americas through the colonization process. But at the same time, not only it's violent, but the last scene of the Iliad, in which Achilles will give back to Priam the body of Hector. This is the scene that is very moving because we have this elderly. Premulo is already an old man, and through the night he will go through the camp of the Greeks, and he asks for his bodies, for his son's body. So he will kiss the hands of those who killed his son and ask for the body to be given to him. So I was reading this where Che Guevara, a warrior like Pagu, Che Guevara, and was killed, and for 30 years his body went missing. So if we look into the story of Latin America, the history of Latin America, the number of bodies that are still missing today. This is a practice that was very common during the colonial period. It was very common during the military dictatorship, and that continues to happen today through the militia and the police force. 10 years ago, the body of Amarildo disappeared. The policeman is still in operation, and we don't know where his body is. Amarildo was killed in a slum in Brazil. In Argentina, we had a president who denied the 30,000 disappeared in the military dictatorship. Still today, we have women that will go into the Atacama Desert trying to find the bodies, the remains of their partners. They will have to excavate maybe a desert to find maybe a foot, a skull to try to elaborate. So the Iliad, no matter how violent it is, it will still guarantee a little bit to be able to mourn the bodies of those we killed and we lost. So the state of necropolitics today will not guarantee this basic thing, to know what happened to your loved one. So at that moment, it was the start for me. It was a kickoff for me. And from that moment on, I said, let's start excavating. Let's leave no stone unturned, because it's what we need. We need to throw these stones back against this immense Western monument. Thank you. Thank you, Luiza. Marcial. Why the Iliad? Why Cassandra?
In my case, I read the Iliad when I was very young in Cuba. There was a director of the National Printing Press, Alencar. He was traveling in the Americas trying to sell his books. He had business with another writer, and he was trying to have low-cost publications in books in the countries of the Americas. He was surprised by the Cuban Revolution, and since he was the most well-known Cuban writer, and Fidel Castro said, in other words, they said, I name you now, you're a revolutionary, you're in charge of the national press. Capetier he was in favor of the revolution, but okay, he said, that's okay, and he became, suddenly, it was like they didn't tell the Cubans that Capetier had gone to Cuba with the triumph of the revolution to join the revolution, but he was actually on business. But it was a good agreement between the triumphant revolution and Carpentier, who was very generous. Alejo Carpentier, he was in charge of the national press. It occurred to him to teach the Cuban people to read and write, and he began to publish Alejo Carpentier, what he considered the great works of human history. The Forner, the Iliad, they were sold at very affordable prices, and it cost like 40 cents. It was what my mother gave me as my allowance for my school lunch, and rather than buying pastry, and I purchased the Iliad for 40 cents, and I began to read the Iliad. The Iliad became, for me, it was my Bible, and I read everything came to mind. The expressions from the Iliad were like, what kind of words could you say, the drunk dog speak? And in school, when somebody said, I turned to them and said, what, you drunk, dog-eyed drunkard, what kind of words are you throwing at me, this epithets? And meanwhile, it was all in parallel at the time, and the epic story in Cuba because Fidel was always speaking at war against imperialism and speaking out against the world. And the sentences that he took from ancient Greece, he loved the phrases like Damocles' sword. Damocles' sword is hovering over your heads. It was a strong rhetoric, and the radio soap operas had this kind of rhetoric. I remember one that they developed in the old, this radio announcer said, when I'm Pharaoh, I will have steel sandals on the priests that oppress my people. So Cuba was enraged, and there were a lot of military songs, the call to war. And so the Iliad was a great book for us in a country where the Bible was considered incorrect. People didn't read the Bible then in all these books. Che's diary, it was an epic story. And I began to read the Iliad as if it were current affairs. And then I read that in ancient Greece, there were this before Christ, everything that they tried to follow Christ's steps. They were imitators of the Iliad in more than the Iliad. Achilles, particularly, for example, Pyrrhus, the king Pyrrhus, the one who just in Greece and conquered Italy, and he suffered the Pyrrhic War. He was an imitator of the Iliad. He had read Iliad, his bedside book. So the Iliad was nothing new. Okay, time went by, had other literary loves. Adrian's lover. And one day when I just woke up, I said, you read the Iliad. The Iliad had such a strong influence in Buenos Aires. I wanted to have the Cassandra story, and the only thing that I knew for certain that it was the kid opened the door and looks at the sea, but it's not the sea in Havana. It's the sea. The sea is at war with people in Cuba, in Havana. It's like they say, it hates you. And the pier, it prevents the sea from swallowing the city and the airport itself. You begin to think that Cuba is a country which loses 400,000 people in a country with 10 million inhabitants. 400,000 people leave on rafts, and they flee the country crossing the Darien's Gulf, but it's in Kayawadi, where they're drug traffickers. It's people want to flee, emigrating. It's constant in Cuba, and this pier in Cuba, in Havana, symbolized that. And my parents took me. I was I moved to Cienfuegos, the town in Cuba, which, unlike Havana, has a sea, which is it's almost a lake, a pond, because it's like a crab. This is the city, and this is the bay. So it's like a little crab. The entrance to the bay, it's a cove. It's so narrow. They call it's a pocket bay, and the sea is very calm. When I began to write this book, I saw this boy who looked out the window and looked at the sea, this calm sea, and little by little, because of an issue of that now I can almost not say how it happened, this young boy began to become someone who is not, it's a transit, it's not in the trance in the sense of a person who always lives in another body. This kind of trance, he feels that he lives in another body, but somebody that died a long time ago, kind of like a mediunic trance. This Cassandra gave me the memory of all this, brought the memory of the Iliad. And Grace, Robert Gray, the English writer Robert Gray, in his book on the Greek myths, Robert Gray, but it was like they live in your mind. They're gods that live in your mind. All these gods from Robert Gray's studies, with an important part of this little book, which is the gods of the African-Cuban pantheon. When we talk about the revolution, Fidel Castro tried to apply the idea of Martí, José Martí. He was more than white, more than black, more than a mulatto. It was beautiful, but if you're below and you say Cuban, more than white, more than black, more than mulatto, but practically they're condemning you to be an underdog because they resolved the racial issue and everybody's equal, but that's not how it happens. And amongst the things that were lost when we attempted to build a country, an atheist country, a Marxist-Leninist country, was the issue of the gods of African-Cuban identity, in which are very present in this novel. Call Me Cassandra, which for me is like a return from the African-Cuban Caribbean, especially gaze and view, how we view the Greek gods, this legacy, this huge legacy of Western civilization, which is like when you take a camera and you're filming and you turn it on back on yourself. And so this is, for me, I tried to do syncretism, backwards and forwards syncretism. Syncretism has always been the West toward the southern countries. Here I tried to do a kind of syncretism from the southern countries to the West. In other words, the great gods from the Cuban Shango, the Orishas, looking at the African-Cuban gods from the Greek pantheon, and that's why the Iliad was one of these first books that was published. Alejo Carpentier. I owe so much to it. He lives in the Cuban imaginary, having published the Iliad with cheap and low-cost, affordable copies in Spanish.
Luiza, voltando pouco.
So Luiza, now again, going back to you, Marcial is showing that in this Bible of war, this handbook of war, there's a universe in which, for him, you brought together the epic aspects with all its issues, with revolution, and much is being silenced behind this. But you will go back into the Afro-Caribbean pantheon as if we had something that is under tension and torsion. And this seems to be really in the heart of the way you see things, the way you approach these matters through poetry, of this basic task. It's so noisy and violent. It is easier maybe to talk about a book which is a narrative, and maybe a bit more difficult to talk about poetry. So for us to better understand a little bit how this process of distorting and having this tension between the epic movement. I love Homer, for instance, the poetry right with Homer. It is maybe worthwhile showing. It starts and how it is seen on the page. Let's see if you can see it here. The Greeks were capable to, and there's nothing, and it's you're playing with silence, you're playing with women, and how do you play with the epical scene? Well, I'm an actress, right? So I am epic actress, almost beastly. So the idea is to play a little bit with poetry from the context of the performance itself. I am a daughter of slams, of music festivals. We might go there sometime. And at a given moment of a creative process, I understand that each poetry will be given to a different character. And this, I always like to thank a person that was very important in this process, which is Marcelino Freire. Marcelino opened the doors to me and said, come and write this book with me. And every Monday we had the possibility of writing something new. And so I understood that I would reread this story, and so that things won't be just too chaotic in terms of my creative process, I will give a voice to each one of my characters, from the most traditional ones, such Agamemnon, and this is this despot who will continue to update himself in all the extreme right figures that we have. Well, I don't know, we have a number of them. And I went to find characters that are not in Homer. For instance, Tenta Zeleia, one of the Amazon warriors, and she scares the Greeks. And it's curious because in the Acropolis, this beautiful architectonic monument of the philosophy and knowledge of the Greek, there are 4 murals, the 4 main battles that the Greeks had to fight to build the city. One would be against the satyrs, the other one against the centaurs, and the third, I cannot remember, but I guess it was the Titans, and the fourth mural against the Amazons. And it's interesting that these women warriors, these women that are not in a position of being subservient, are compared to figures that are monstrous, that are not human. And it's interesting how this thought will be the basis for a sexist position in society for women. So there is this poem for Penthesilea, there's one for Cassandra, there's for Ilione and Polyxena. These are women who have this historical cancellation that are not even part of the official history. And once again, we are at a flip. Oh my God, Freudian slip. I said floopy, which is the literary festival of the peripheries. And we are paying tribute to Patricia Gavão. It's important to revisit these characters and people who throughout the 19th and 20th century will open the path and show us the way. So the process was to try and understand what kind of epical gesture each character would have. There's one that is acerto de contas, like Marcial has this Cassandra, although traveled throughout the centuries. It's Andromaca. She sometimes is talking to, don't even say that you're not coming. I am afraid of that I will regret this. So just don't come to me and say, oh my God, now I have my own findings. Deal with your ghosts. There are poems that she writes to Polyxena where she actually welcomes her, embraces her and say, I know I know your scars. I know that you did what you could. And there are poems in which she will talk to Hector. And so this narrative voice, this epical voice of this trans-secular figure or character who will arrive thinking that it's been 3 millennia, but it's still yesterday. Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. Well, we decided that we would read a bit of your books because since you were talking about your poetry, be it Andromaca or Cassandra, and also I thought that it was especially beautiful the way Marcial went back to this sea that will be sort of a Cienfuegos lagoon. And Call Me Cassandra, there's something really interesting about the translation. From the Portuguese edition in continental Portuguese, it will be Chamam-me Cassandra. Here is Me Chama Cassandra, which is more intimate. The whole issue of coming closer to this character, it's a bit of more, it's closer and a bit more violent. So this sea, the sea is in the beginning, of course in the Greeks, it's in the beginning of Marcial's book and at the end of also his book. So we decided that we would read. So maybe if we could bring the microphone, please. We would read and we even talk to the interpreter. So those who are listening to the simultaneous interpretation, they will not translate now Marcial speaking in Spanish, because then we will have him reading the last chapter, the last paragraph. It's no spoiler, but and he will read it in Spanish, and then Luiza will read it in Portuguese, and this is how we will play. So something will happen. So you have Marcial, you have the part you are going to read, and so let's hear it in Spanish. Oops.
You're looking at a piece of driftwood by the sea, a tiny piece of driftwood that you find amongst the rocks where the beach is more barren. You're looking at this piece of driftwood and there's something written on it in a language that carries you to former times, and this piece of driftwood, so old, it's so old that it's impossible for you to be holding it, and it begins to grow, to take an undulated shape, to make it something else, and you become something else in front of the driftwood, and you're sitting on the seaside, which is not the Cuban sea, and behind you is the city, and you are also someone else. You are Cassandra, and in a few minutes they're going to call you by your winged name. Come, they say, come, run here, because the ships are approaching. Leave this old statue of Hecate left by the priests, come to the temple of Poseidon, and we'll sing these songs which we love so much. Cassandra, come.
You are looking to a piece of wood
que você encontrou entre as pedras. Também guardamos pedras aqui. Ali onde a praia fica mais agreste, você fica olhando para esse pedaço de madeira em que há algo escrito em uma linguagem que te leva a outros tempos, faz mais de 3 milênios ontem. E então esse pedaço de madeira tão antigo, que é impossível que esteja em suas mãos, começa a crescer, a tomar uma forma ondulada, a se tornar outro, e você se torna outra diante da madeira, e você está sentada na margem de um mar que não é cubano. E atrás de você está a cidade, e você também é outra, é finalmente Cassandra, e em poucos minutos eles vão te chamar pelo seu nome alado. Vem, eles dirão, vem, corre aqui, porque os navios estão se aproximando. Deixa essa velha estátua de Hécate descartada pelos sacerdotes. Vem para o templo de Poseidon. Vem e vamos cantar aquelas canções que tanto gostamos. Vem, Cassandra. Cassandra, vem. Vences, porque entender a desgraça não é o mesmo que remediá-la. Primeiro você dirá, está podre. Depois, com perícia, raspará da polpa a casca, gosmento, o chorume se espalha. Há fungos pré-históricos, há fungos abençoados. Está podre. Você repetirá a didática. Eles continuarão a palitar os dedos do pé. Talvez você chore, talvez arranque do pubis ao queixo todos os cabelos uma mulher carbonizada no meio da avenida. Talvez você mostre relatórios do Ibama, a fotografia aérea de crianças vietnamitas, fatos antes incontestáveis. Fatos antes, nunca mais. Eles continuarão a palitar os dedos do pé. Talvez te chamem de louca ou naive. São incontáveis as formas de se deslegitimar uma mulher. Ote, você está falando grego, Cassandra. Vem, Cassandra, vem, Cassandra. Ote, você está falando grego. Seus seios em chama está podre. Ainda assim, eles se lambuzarão. Eu não conheci Troia. Ruínas a mais, ruínas a menos. Também guardamos pedras aqui, do outro lado do oceano. Tudo o que eu aprendi foi nesse alfabeto moderno. Eis o momento apoteótico. Minha obsessão. Nossos despojos é Troia. Minhas amigas encurraladas na mesa do chefe é Troia. A moça, jovem, saco plástico no rosto, festa de luxo, é Troia. As baratas roendo o cu da guerrilheira comunista é Troia. É Troia o fotógrafo baleado no rosto. É Troia as vítimas de feminicídio, as lideranças perseguidas, os copos desovados no mangue. É Troia. Os milicos, os fascistas, os tiranos todos disparam contra a Troia, Andrômaca. O Ocidente, a literatura, a filosofia, a democracia, a humanidade nascem da devastação de Troia. Agora você entende por que eu voltei? Eu não conheci Troia, mas entrevejo esplêndida, nas carícias clandestinas, durante os bombardeios e gás de pimenta, nas clínicas de aborto, nos abrigos inusitados, no canto, sim, no canto, eu não vou me entregar. Você Andrômaca. Você, Patrícia Galvão, você grita, eu repito, através dos séculos, minha irmã. Não há poemas para você. Nenhuma linha sobre Cibele. Quando perdemos o tino, quando virou espetáculo, maldita literatura e seu panteão de vitórias. Me abrace forte. A explosão está próxima. Ela há de vir.
Yes, it will come. Pagu, Cassandra. Luiza, I'm going to ask you a question, so just try to breathe in. And first of all, you bring the power of the word, the word that is held in the air, this space, the vibration, this sensory element in poetry, which is in its origin is said, spoken, not written. But at the same time, you have your university backdrop. You're a scholar and you're a slammer. So tell us a little bit about this experience. I know that there are future projects you'll have that have to do with this the choral, the chorus word in the Greek sense of the word, actually. What does it mean to you to be a slammer and a poet of the book of the same time, of the written word at the same time? What slam, poetry battles, and everything, you know. We did everything without any kind of musical support. And Roberta Estrela Dava was sitting right here. She brought it too. She brought it. So thank you. 15 years of slamming. So if it weren't the slams, if it weren't the musical festivals, I wouldn't be there. I would be still. I love theater, but I wouldn't be a slammer. But I am a slam poet. So it's important to say this. It's a living thing. It will do away with borders, with frontiers between art, knowledge, the academy, and everything that is being produced in the more popular areas. Also, public policies of rendering the Brazilian Academy less sophisticated. We have people now, slammers, doing PhDs, masters. This whole idea of having a researcher and have something that is the object or the topic of your research is one of the hierarchy of a colonial thought that we're doing away with. So 2020, I started studying literary structure, and to understand slamming. We will be published next year by Editora Nós, telling a little bit about this experience and this poetry that will be the result of this meeting. It is a public act, a collective act, in which word cannot be separated from breath, from rhythm, from pace, and all these different ideas, different medias. It's not a silenced literature. Using what Edmilson said once, it will end up opening all the different elements that have to do with us. That's it. Thank you. So now let's shift gears and let's talk about politics. Of course, we are still talking about literature. This is maybe another bridge, another path, a very artificial bridge that is trying to divide politics and literature and separate them. It's very clear to us that literature and politics are one and the same. Literature is politics and politics is literature. So I want to go back, Marcial, to a great historical constellation that is also part of your book, Call Me Cassandra, which is the relation between Angola and Cuba. For those who remember, well, Cuba has a very strong presence in the civil war in Angola after the independence, and this will go up up to the 80s, 90s. And they have a strong relation with racism, because it also includes a struggle with South African, an apartheid South African soldiers. So everything is there in this Cassandra of yours, saying things that no one wants to listen to. And maybe here in Brazil, Marcial, in general, our public will better understand this public because of the Angolan side of things. People will remember the book Don Jackie, Bom Dia Camaradas. And you have a different vision, the vision of those who will go from Cuba to Angola. You've certainly seen people from your generation taking this path. So I wanted to ask you, what is this story all about, and what is your relation to this history of ghosts and Cassandras in Africa?
Fine. My relationship with this story, as you said, is clear. I was very young. I went to the war in Angola as a volunteer, and I was about ready to go because of problems. In other words, when there's a war, in the American films, and you had little dog tags. This is essential because if you die, you have a dog tag. They can identify you from the dog tag. And when I was ready to get on the airplane, a soldier, they said his nickname was Death. He said Death because he was very thin, and they said you can't go to Angola because you have problems with you lost your dog tags. And I was so sad because I'd lost my dog tag, and I thought they were going to go to some. I wanted to fight in this beautiful cause for the revolution. My father was very staunch communist. When I came home after that disappointment, I saw he was relieved. He said that he couldn't say with words. It was crazy to drop out of school and go and fight in Angola. It had a very strong impact, this issue of Angola. I treated this indirectly in several of my books. When I was in Buenos Aires, long later, I was in a writer's workshop, a reading, and the Spanish-speaking people and Portuguese-speaking people turned their backs on each other. We only met when Brazil and Argentina were playing, or Portugal and Argentina were playing in football matches. Otherwise, they turn their backs on each other, the Portuguese and Spanish-speaking peoples. But suddenly, one of the people that was giving this reading workshop, the book they brought me, The General Theory of Oblivion by Luiza, and I read this book, which dazzled me. There's a wonderful story by Luiza, and it called my attention. The Cubans were the others in this book, this issue of being the other, the evil people, or the mysterious. We don't know who they are. They're unknown, strangers. They mobilize you. That mobilizes you. It touches you. To be the other is something very moving, and it occurred to me to write a novel to respond to this book by Luiza, The Story of Oblivion. It was one of the stories that made me want to propose a novel where the Cubans aren't the other, but rather the Cubans are the protagonists. It's us, but it's the opposite for them. In this Cuban army that went to Angola for a cause, it's not based on beauty to free a country from capitalist oppression. It was like in the 1980s in Cuba, to be a homosexual, to be trans, it was like to be black in the United States, in the South, in the antebellum, in the Forney, when they realized that he was to be in a hot place in the South. A man was speaking in a barber shop, and he said to the barber, this black man, Bill, I want to lynch him. The barber said, but I know Bill. Bill is a good person. And the man said, but we're going to lynch him. He was a black lover. You're going to defend him? And this you experience with homosexuals in Cuba. In Cuba, if you're studying in the university at that time and you were gay at that time, the collective of students got together in a gay gang. They said, so-and-so is gay, and they threw you out of the university. But not just because you're gay, just to be effeminate, to appear gay. If you had a way of sitting, if you're a male, I would sit like this and cross my leg. Somebody could say, oh, he's gay, probably. He's that black guy there. He's kind of effeminate. That's the way I sit. Fine. And it was the same thing for women who had deep eyes, or she's loose woman. You couldn't enter the university for the simple fact that the university is for revolutionaries, and a gay person or a loose woman, so to speak, that period. If you're Catholic, okay, fine, you could see what it means, this kind of Catholicism being in the university. But if you're gay or you're a loose woman, a free woman, so how could it be that a young person, a revolutionary, at that age could defend someone with these weaknesses? That's what people said in Cuba in the 1980s. So all the Cubans, the heterosexuals, the straight people, we read these people who were marginalized, discriminated against, and destroyed. They destroyed them. And in a sense, this Cassandra, who becomes others with this Cuban army, they believe that they're the good people, the heroes. It was important for me to have this issue of that the world is like a great, this, like the matroska, the Russian puppets, one inside the other. And this novel, it's clear, it was like an army with good intentions, relatively good intentions, well-intentioned, although I don't believe that if you go kill somebody on the other side, you can build anything good. To a certain extent, violence is, as she's just said, this moment, we believed that violence was going to lead to something valid. This is something when I presented the edition in Portugal of my book, the Portuguese edition and the French edition in France, I said that the countries, the European countries, the grand European countries had with something in common with Cuba, which is not very common in Latin America, which to share the army and women for your country with others. This issue of going armed, and you go armed to another country as an armed force, it's going to fall on the heads of people that stay. It's going to have repercussions. Cuba lived this as if it were a European country, like the Cuban Armada. It was 500,000 men in Angola, the death in a country with 10 million inhabitants. Angola was like an open, festering wound. Angola, for many Cubans, still is a source of anguish. Time has gone by. Nevertheless, it's difficult. It's virtually one of these walls that people can never traverse. It was positive or negative. There's some authors who think that it was a reason for pride because Cuba defeated the major powers, and the person who was a North American politician who was so important, he wrote a book which was trying to convince other countries in the capitalist country that it was possible to defeat the Cubans. In other words, Cuba, in other words, is something very similar to perhaps the ancient Athenians. And when I read Ulysses, this source, I felt that it was very similar to this group of Cuban expeditionaries, had a lot to do with, as described in the source. But this being the other is a strong thing, and it's not very common in Latin Americans. I had a Chilean friend, I haven't seen her for a long time, and one time when we were in Cuba, she said had gone to an island, which the Chileans it was one a Chilean island, but the inhabitants of this island were not Chileans, so that she went as a progressive person and everything. And she said that they'd looked at her askance, and she said, "Okay, why? Why don't you like me? I mean," and the people, she was a Chilean. You're here, but you're not one of us. And when I was studying architecture, there was a friend, an Angolan friend that I loved, Hernani, his name. And so whenever something happened for the Angolan-Cuban issue, all the Cubans were happy. And he put my hand on my back, and you should thank us that we were liberated. And he said to us, but why should I thank you when he's told me, not just to the other Cubans, he knew that I understood him, not to the other Cubans, go to the members of UNITA or MPLA, the other side of the Civil War. And for a Cuban, he's a member for me, he's a cousin, a friend, a brother. And it was terrible, this feeling that he had of loneliness, of gratitude to Cuba. They were giving the opportunity to study architecture in a Cuban university, but also it made no sense, the war, to feel that, for example, the Cuban troops came to part of Angola and they disembarked, and there was a group of village that didn't even know what Angola was, because the borders, the national borders, are a creation of the colonial countries. For someone in a village in certain parts of Angola, they don't even know if you cross the border, for example, in Mozambique. They had no idea that people on the other side is Namibia or whatever. This is the war, and it's a difficult issue to digest. And the countries that have participated in wars in other countries and other lands, they're countries that are always complicated because of this issue. And in the books, and at the time of Dos Santos in Angola, people virtually did not mention the Cuban support for the liberation. It's very rare, this issue. This was Dos Santos, the president of Angola.
Epical, and well, of course, you can also address your questions. You have your little pieces of paper there. You just fill it out, and people from Flip will find you and bring the questions to us. Maybe again, changing gears. Once again, I would like to refer to a very interesting, because we know the public wants to know a little bit about you as writers, as also readers. Yesterday, Dion Brand talked about the genealogy of the poets. She was talking about Aimé Césaire. So who are the poets that would be on your shelf, literal or not, the poets that are to you great guides? And how do you read them, see them? How do you write about them? What is the liturgy of writing? How do you write? This is a question that I have, especially curious in the case of Luiza. Not that I would imagine like Marcial would be just sitting in this really nice, clean, isolated place. I believe there's lots of noise wherever you imagine yourself writing. But in the case of Luiza, this relation with slam is with sound, noise, this amazing energy that we have just seen, which is different from this very stereotyped idea of isolation of those who write. So who are the poets and what library you have in you? And how do you work with this poetry? Well, my name is Luiza because of Luiza Erundina. So in terms of genealogy, that's the beginning. Luiza Erundina was the mayor of São Paulo, a very leftist person. My brother, Chico, the other one is Caetano, also Brazilian musicians, and the youngest one is Betânia. So I couldn't just write. I had to perform. I guess my childhood is meshed with this poetry, which is Cassandra also, that will go through the spoken word. Between childhood and slams, there's this moment of theater. I decided to study to become an actress. I never wrote, actually, never wrote a play or anything. I guess my work is in poetry or in the narratives or storytelling. So when I get in touch with slams, this is the main genealogy that will make me a poet. I had already written Romão, Bandeira, Cecília Meirelles, these poets from the Brazilian modernist movement. But these were the partners of the poetry that are my main reference. So it's such a privilege to be able to watch most of them here in the stage, like Nelson Maca, Ana Vitrolira, Natasha Felix. Lots of those who are producing this. More than a genealogy, I would think about a constellation, and you know. Oh yes, Bino said something. Bino says a lone star. No.
Uma Dorinha sozinha não faz.
One swallow doesn't make a spring. I think that's someone who's using. So one swallow does not make spring, but it might wake up the whole world. So we are a band of birds. We are a constellation. We are those who are trying to reach the skies. So, and we want to do it regardless of all the bombs and shots and wars. One thing that you said, it was really beautiful, that Gabriel Garcia Marques said to her, well, Ascioli said this yesterday, because she said that her eyes would shine bright whenever she talked about poetry and writing. So this is the idea. I have this passion. Sometimes I'm not sure what the project will become. In the case of Troy, I had this obsession with Troyans, and I wanted to read the Iliad. I want to think it in a more contemporary stance. And I said, yeah, go. We're not sure where you're going, but let's do it. This is where I would really feel passionate about. So sometimes I will just spend a long time listening to things, doing, research, reading, talking to people, and then I start writing. And even due to the fact that I deal with very, heavy topics. In Pedras is to think the massacres. And then I talk about feminicide, of gender violence, a book that will deal with rape, and rape in which the victim is drugged or what have you. So I couldn't stay writing for too long because it would be too hard. So normally I do all the mapping and then I start writing. I write and then 2-3 months I'll be able to write. And then I'll just go back to review, rewrite a couple of bits according to the partners that will comment and help me. So in the sense, my process will go through this kind of production. And in terms of a spoken word, since I was never able to separate, I write speaking. At the beginning, I would only speak. I would speak and creating poetry as I walked around the street. Now lately, I try to type it, and it's as if I talk as I type. And Elise, recorded me, and that I was talking to the screen. So even in the academic tests, I do sort of a performance. And for poetry, oh my God, I cannot write without actually going through the piece, the rhythm, and the voice. Thank you, Luiza. It's beautiful that you're talking not about genealogy, but the constellation. We can imagine sometimes a tree when think about a tree, but a constellation. And looking to Roberta Estrela Dalva, her name Estrela is a star in Portuguese, and she's also a slammer. But before I pass the floor to Marcial, since you referred to Nadine, a very deep relation with stones, which is the title of your book, and this is it is a novel that is in the form of a poem talking about a feminicide. Could you talk about this precious little book of yours? I published it last year, and it's almost. I I play a little bit about the structure of the book. So it's sort of a crime fiction, and it will revisit, like independent publishing. And with Silvia Nastari from Keloni, we tried to have like a detective's journal. So we stamped everything one to one as if it was like this file, the confidential files. And I love crime fiction. I love the Netflix series, the streamings that have to do, with true crime and stuff like that. You have to decipher an enigma. But sometimes the women characters are only the victims normally. These are bodies that are violated, bodies that sometimes you have this very spectacular representation of the crime. It's almost like a second violence or violence all over again. And I thought, well, maybe this is something that I read a lot about, but I feel I'm not very comfortable with it, because sometimes the story will end up with some kind of a tribute to the police, and because they were able to solve that crime. Normally it's a very bright detective, a very smart detective to solve the structural issue, which is a gender violence. And that is just a tip of the iceberg of this thing that goes through the violence, domestic violence, compensation, violence against bodies. So in the case of Nadine, I thought about this argument, the justification that would render unstable this conservative way that we have this crime fiction. So it's a story of this girl. She is killed, she's murdered, and since she's not an ideal person, the police will not investigate. So it is her body that will investigate her own murder. So she's a dead detective that will try to rebuild the last night of the crime, and it's everything in poetry. Marcial, what does your library look like? And how do you write?
Fine. In my own case, I have a lot of literary sources like Luiza, the last teacher that I had, or inspiration, my last teacher. I have to acknowledge my teacher when I was about 2 years ago. I had a serious accident and I broke my hip bone. I remember that one of the doctors had two different names. It was very strong for a Cuban. One was called Moncada and the other one was Castro. They were two figures, and Fidel Castro won the Revolutionary War in Moncada. And if you don't operate on you, you will never walk again. And I blanched, and I loved to run and everything. This was when I was entering the room in the hospital, and suddenly I began to read Toni Morrison. I read several different of her novels, and this was when I had a hip fracture. And I read a novel of a poor black man and who runs through these towns as if his own shadow were chasing him. And I suddenly was in this hospital running with this figure and more concerned about what was happening than what was happening with me, and had a broken hip. And it was a great encounter with this character of Toni Morrison, who was a great one of the greatest writers in the Americas. But I read Vallejo, Fernando Pessoa. I read a lot of poetry and Vallejo, and I've got a copy. This Margaret Yourcenar's The Lover, and I read this prose. I think that I can write prose myself. It interests me, and I continued to read the classics, the Latin American classics, the great Cuban writers, Carpentier, Reinaldo Arena, and Borges, the great poets and Drummond de Andrade, Machado de Assis. Currently, I read a lot of the most recent books because, so to speak, I love to take interest in reading. I read a great novel recently with The Time of Hurricanes by Fernando, a Mexican writer, a great writer, a great novel, beautiful novel, like one of the great Latin American novels. And so I read a lot. Reading for me is almost like chewing. Every day I chew and I read. 5 in the morning, 7 in the morning, I start reading, and I read all day long. And my first literary influence was my mother. My mother never considered Spanish as a dead language. She always used metaphors. It was very difficult to say something that could be said with 2 words. In 2 words, she said it in 6, 7 words. She had phrases like catchphrases. There's so many catchphrases, it's difficult to remember. There was a problem between 2 people. She used to say they were rhyme in Spanish, if you can translate it in Portuguese. Let me see, Carlota and Lola. It was and there was 2 people that didn't want the same thing, but they had to come to an agreement. So I used a lot of metaphors. Carlota and Lola have to come to an understanding. And every time more I understand how important this metaphorical language is that my mother used to teach me, using metaphors for me all the time, which my first literary influence was my mother, without even her realizing it, unbeknownst to her. Thank you, Marcial.
Bom, antes de fazer uma última.
Before we go into our last question for both of you, and talk about the performance, and of course both Luiza and Marcial will be signing their books at the Travessa bookshop, and you are all invited, one and all. And there's this question from Fernando from the audience, and it's addressed to Luiza. Your next research on soccer and the Iliad topic brings me to this question. It is still common to see xenophobia and racism in the stadium. Do you think this behavior is of human nature, or is this a prison that we are unable to escape from? Fernando, you have to wait for me to write the next book, and the answer will be there, I can assure you. But this is a great question. This is what I'm interested in thinking, to see this connection between voice and violence. It isn't something exclusive of the football world, and it is, we have to think about how organized fan clubs will be persecuted by and criminalized in history. To think about how the stands are also a place for identity and collectiveness. So these are just some of the issues I'm trying to deal with, tackle. And I've read Mara Moira. She has done this wonderful work in terms of thinking all these issues when she writes about football. She's a Palmeiras fan, like I am. So this is what I'm trying to look into. This is basically it. I wrote in the beginning of the year an essay for Sesc Pompeia, where I already start maybe touch the surface of this thing. It's a sort of a boy that ends up being killed in a conflict with the police. So I'm going there. I'm just still thinking about what to do. Maybe in a couple of years I'll be back to answer more precisely. Thank you, Luiza. So just to conclude, I would like to, before I ask the question to Marcial, we will have a performance right next door by Luna Vitrolira. Quem dá amor às vezes é isso. But before, since you brought Cassandra into the stage, and Cassandra will see the future, and therefore she suffers for it. I guess we all want to know, what does the future hold for us? Marcial is living in Argentina, so, well, not much has to be said there in terms of looking into the future. It's a bit scary, I guess. And we are living this stalemate moment in Brazil. So what will the future hold for you? Marcial, please.
I believe that I don't know what to say. It's kind of complicated. I believe that what happened in Argentina is not something that happened. It's no coincidence. I believe that Latin American democracy, the Latin American left, is in like a dead end. I see a lot of my compatriots that are abroad or even in Cuba or express solidarity with Milei, who is an individual who is dictatorial with his intentions. Why? Because the Cubans specifically tend to embrace causes. The problem is that, amongst other things, the left, it's hard for them to understand that what's happening in Cuba is not exactly a leftist government. This photograph from the 1959, where you can see Fidel Castro and the doves. This is history now. The Cuban government is increasingly a government which is much more, which increasingly gets worse and worse. It doesn't give standard of life, decent standard of life to the people. For example, on July 11th, there are a lot of political prisoners who are serving long sentences because they demanded economic improvements and more democracy. And this great Chilean president who is capable, who didn't, a lot of politicians on the left still support this, the progressive, and this means that things become more complex. I believe that when someone takes power who represents a different tendency, this provides the opportunity for a country at this time that they've been governing for so many years to remeasure and reset what they've done wrong and try to change and improve. The forces of Peronism and the Peronism in the central left in Argentina are 43% of the population that voted for them. So it's not something that you can be overlook. I think Argentina is a divided country, but I believe it has a great future. And I'm not that worried so much, much more with the country Cuba, which needs to change. There have to be immediate changes in Cuba, and I hope that there aren't changes that are extreme changes that turn the country that's become a terror into a company that commits even more terror. And I, as a Cuban, which is basically who I am, I'm concerned about this future of Cuba, and I hope that one day the left or the right or whoever, or the center, whoever's in power, we can reach an agreement for Cuba to become a prosperous country and a country where there's respect for human values and spirituality and all these things. Thank you very much, Marcial.
Well, I have to, the curators let me know that we ran out of time. Luiza, Cassandra, 10 seconds, the future. We're out of time, but not the future.